Greetings and welcome back to Race, Place, and Inequality. Today we are going to be discussing systemic racism and racial formation theory. The reason why I want to discuss these two theories is because these are the two major kind of racial theories that have influence and set the stage for how we understand and how we talk about race in modern day sociology. And so with both Fagan's systemic racism and Omi and Wanat's racial formation theory kind of guiding the way in which we discuss race in modern day sociology, I think that it's necessary to at least kind of start off this way. This is not, what's going on? Okay, all right. I thought my recording, I don't know, something went wrong. There was a glitch there. Although this is not specifically a race class, I do teach a race class where the whole semester is just on race, and we're kind of looking at how race and place intersect. I still believe that this is necessary, at least for us to start off, right? Start off the conversation around race. So we're going to first start off talking about systemic racism, and then we're going to go into racial formation theory. In reading Joe Fagan's book, Racist America, right, which was really put in place. I think he started writing it maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the reason why is because it was during this time that people were asking this question: why is race continually part of the discussion, right? Part of the social discussion. Have we not gotten past this, right? We understand pre-civil rights, because pre-civil rights, it was very blatant. Jim Crow was very blatant. It was very clear. White only, colored only. People could use the N-word freely on television. If you weren't a racist, it was likely that you weren't going to win a Southern office, right? A Southern seat. Now, you couldn't be something like pro-lynching, even though there were politicians, white politicians who were pro-lynching, but that was seen as being something a bit more archaic, right? We don't do that kind of thing in the United States. Clearly people did, but that, you couldn't go that far, but you could be pro-segregation. Absolutely. You could absolutely be pro-segregation. You could absolutely be pro-white supremacy and the protection of, American democracies and American traditions and ideas. So it was clear why we would bring up race then, and maybe even shortly after the civil rights movement. But I mean, come on, the 1970s and 1980s, we see a rise in the Black middle class. We see more Black politicians. We see more Black people graduating from college. We see more Black people entering into professional jobs and positions. Why are we still having this conversation? It's the 90s. This is over. This is done with, right? And so then people of color, particularly Black people, are saying, no, yes, we have seen this growth since the civil rights movement. We have seen this growth in the ways in which in the lives that African Americans can live. However, there are also other issues that are occurring that are making it difficult for a large sector of Black folks. Yes, the Black middle class is increasing, but the Black middle class looks nothing like the white middle class, number one. Number two, the level of poverty among Black people is so much more deleterious, right? Particularly urban poverty is so much more concentrated among Black folks, particularly in the urban core, than it is for white folks, right? You couple that poverty with deindustrialization, and I'm more than likely, especially since we're talking about place, we'll talk about deindustrialization and William Julius Wilson and all this stuff throughout the semester. But this deindustrialization and many Black people in these large urban areas losing their jobs. I mean, what this is happening. You have the onset of the crack epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s. You have police brutality. You have the LA riots because of police brutality that was blatant, yet and still the American justice system saw it fair and saw it right for these police officers to beat this man half to death. Talking about Rodney King, for those who may not know, feel free to Google it or watch a documentary on it. There's a bunch of them out there, which led to the LA riots. Well, that and the shooting of a young Black girl named Latasha Harlins, who was shot by a Korean grocery store owner in Los Angeles, and she ended up getting community service. Right, got shot in the back of the head. Latasha Harlins did, got shot in the back of the head. The grocery store owner got community service, and the Black community was outraged, right? And so between that and then the fact that the police officers that beat up Rodney King were found not guilty, it set off an entire riot, one of the worst riots in modern American history, modern U.S. history. And so again, you have these things that are going on. And in the 90s, people are asking, white people and Black people and people of color asking the question, why do we keep discussing race? White people are saying, why are we discussing race? And Black people are saying, why do we keep having to talk about race? Right? And so this becomes the question, right? This becomes the discourse. And so Fagan says, well, let's really get back to the foundation of how America got started. Let's look back on the United States and how the United States was founded and see how race fits into the very fabric of this country. And when Fagan does that, he starts to uncover that America is very much a racist country at its core, right? This is his argument. Joe Fagan is the previous president of the American Sociological Association. He's probably one of the foremost scholars on race. He taught at University of Florida. He taught at Texas A&M. He's mentored many people, including people that have mentored me. And so he's published books with people that have mentored me and were my professors as well. And so his ideas and particularly his theory on systemic racism definitely sits heavy, particularly within the sociological discipline, but also within the larger discourse as well. So you probably heard the term systemic racism before, just probably in the news or in mainstream conversation. And so it's necessary, right, to start with this. And so as Joe Fagan begins to, in this particular text, he does more of a historical analysis, right? He's not really using empirical evidence in terms of doing anything like quantitative collecting, like surveys or anything like that. It's just strictly kind of a historical analysis to see where does race fit in the overall fabric of the United States. And as we go through this lecture, this is what we'll find, and we'll see the conclusion that essentially Joe Fagan comes to, right? When answering the question, why do we continue to talk about race? Why does race keep coming up? Why is race continually being a thing in this country? And so we start here with first looking at, complicating this idea of the North and the South, and who was pro-slavery and who was anti-slavery. And a lot of times it's people like to say that, well, it was the South who was pro-slavery and they were the ones who were benefiting from it, and the Northerners were these liberals who were open to everyone. And you had places like Philadelphia and New York and places where Black people could go and be free and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, it wasn't really like that though, right? While on the surface, yes, right? You had the South that, again, benefited a lot from slavery. You have the South that believed in states' rights. You had the South that essentially, part of the reason why they fought for the Confederacy was to maintain their way of life. And slavery was a key part of that way of life. Um, and so it was in the South where you have these kind of blatant ideas around racial separation. But what he's saying is the North is not let off the hook either. Because while the North did not necessarily maintain slaves or enslaved people, they absolutely benefited from it. Because those factories in the North could not run without the raw materials that were coming from the South. And those factories in the North could not have stayed open had they not turned those raw goods into materials and sold those materials all over the world, even sold it back to the South. So the people in the North couldn't have gotten rich without the slavery of that took place in the South. And so to try to pretend as if they too were not invested in racism is a lie, and it's dishonest, and it's just inaccurate. And so what he's saying is that both Northerners and Southerners were pro-slavery during colonial times because they both profited from the system. And the only reason why Northerners stopped practicing slavery, because at one point they did early on, was because the weather just didn't permit. That was the main reason. But it wasn't necessarily because people in the North were just nicer or more liberal than people in the South. So it's very important that we recognize that. It's very important that we understand that it's not just the South, it's all of America that really has a racial problem. It's all of the United States. And so what he does is he delves into the early stages of the country's development. He goes into the Constitutional Convention. He looks at documents. He looks at statements. And what he finds is that within these statements, while there is not explicit language that promotes slavery, because that would not look good to the rest of the world, because that is absolutely against what the United States says that it is on paper, right? And what they preach and what they fought for, right? Fought for freedom from the British, fought for freedom to be themselves, and then in turn put on paper that you then enslave an entire group of people. It just wouldn't make sense. So if you look at early documents, they're very cryptic, hidden, very calculated language that allows for the continuing of slavery without actually saying it. Does that make sense? And so a lot of times there's language that is used like property. You hear the term property a lot in early US documents. And that term property is kind of like a way of saying slave or enslaved person or whatever, without actually saying it, right? And so what we see is in these early documents, this idea of freedom for early US citizens is this notion of being able to protect your property and to produce a profit. That is freedom. Property is the main object of society. Having your property, protecting your property at all costs, and not allowing people to have access to your property, and not allowing people to take away your property, right? And so this is freedom. And so to the outside world, okay, well, that's understandable, your house or your horse and carriage or whatever. But in the United States, there was a certain segment of the population that was considered to be property. And so when you see property, property is like another name, or it's kind of coded language for a slave. And so even those who, so this is what Fagan is seeing in these early documents. And also what he finds is that even those people who are opposed to slavery were not opposed to slavery based on some moral or human right. Nowadays, if you were to ask somebody, most white people, whether they're racist or not, if they agree with slavery, most white people will say, and there's even quantitative evidence to support this, most white people will say, no, slavery is bad. Slavery was wrong. Every time we see it, it makes us sick to our stomach. This was a sick time in in American history, right? Why? If you ask why, well, because it's just morally wrong. You're not supposed to treat people like that, right? Now, some of those same people could probably be anti-Black Lives Matter or anti-affirmative action, but and so that's a whole nother, that's where you get into Bonilla Silva's colorblind racism piece. But most people, regardless of color, would argue that slavery was wrong. And again, the reason why is based on this moral kind of human right that that's just not how you treat people. However, at that time, that was not the reason why most people, particularly most white people, oppose slavery. The reason why, this is what Fagan finds, the reason why most white people opposed slavery during that time was because of the negative effects it would have on white people. He says that they argued that it had negative effects on the defense of the nation. It made white people lazy, essentially. White people would essentially become lazy if slavery continued. Why is that? Well, if you have this large segment of the population, and this population is constantly having another group of the population to work for them, to do all of their work for them. When it's time to defend the country, when it's time to fight the British, the Spanish, the Germans, whoever, right? Anybody who now attacks our country, when it's time to fight, first things first, we're not letting Native Americans fight. We're not letting African people fight. They are not good enough to fight for this country. They will not be given that privilege. Only white men can fight for the country. But if white men are going to fight for the country, they have to be prepared. They have to be strong. They have to be ready to deal with going to war, being in battle. You have to be very tough. You have to be in shape. You have to be ready to defend. And essentially, slavery makes white people lazy. They don't have to do anything. So when it's time to defend the country's going to fall to whoever, because the people that are supposed to defend it are not strong. And so that was the reason why a lot of people opposed slavery. Not because it was morally wrong, it was because it made white people lazy. So again, there's a white centeredness even in abolitionists. Even in people who wanted to even in the anti-slavery sentiment, it was centered on what was best, not for the oppressed, but for the oppressor, right? And so American colonists felt like being taxed by the British was similar to slavery. However, they didn't see how the enslavement of African people were any different. And so the question is, well, why? How can they see that being taxed by the British when they couldn't be represented in Parliament was the exact same way as being enslaved? They felt like they were enslaved. They felt like they were captive, held captive. But they didn't feel that that was the same thing when they brought African people from West Africa. So then the question is why? Well, the notion of natural law. Natural law was this idea that said that people who were not white, people who were not European white, were naturally seen as subservient. White males specifically. They were naturally seen as subservient. They're supposed to be made, their purpose on earth is to serve white folks, essentially, right? And what was used to justify this was a false historical narrative of Africa, right? To say that Africa was this place with jungles, and it was uncivilized for so long, and it was slavery and Europeans who came to Africa and brought these people to the United States and civilized them and made them into human beings that could be useful to society to help build a nation. It wasn't just white people that thought that way. There were actually some very pronounced Black people that had this kind of same idea. Phyllis Wheatley was a famous poet, famous Black poet, And some of her poems kind of reflected this idea, this thanking of America for bringing the African out of the jungles and out of the backwards caves of Africa into this beautiful, you know, advanced country and society. And anybody who's done any remotely any history knows that that's wrong. Some people argue that because Phyllis Wheatley wrote like that, that was the reason why she was elevated in terms of her poetry. Because there were lots of people who wrote, though there were other Black people who wrote during her time that did not feel that way. And I imagine that's probably why they were not elevated as high. Right? Now, not all of Phyllis Wheatley's poems were like this. She has some very beautiful pieces, but some of them were, and that is why, you know, she can be seen as a very controversial figure. Right? Fagan also argues that anti-Black racism was the foundation for the democracy, not just in terms of the way people thought and the way people behaved, but the actual people and policies. What he found is that up until the end of slavery, 10 US presidents actually practiced and owned enslaved people. The founder of the American Psychiatry Association owned Black Americans, participated in slavery. The founder of the Quakers, one of the earliest liberal religious organizations in the country, all of these people owned Black Americans at some point. They all practiced slavery. And now we're starting to see where universities like Brown and, you know, so many of I think Harvard as well, are putting up statues or memorials and some have even apologized for their early use of slave money that came from enslaved people to start these universities. But a large number of you know, very wealthy people during that time that started these universities, a lot of that money came from money that was used, slave money, essentially. Right. So what he's saying is that these early presidents, early people who created the foundation for what America is, what the American dream would be, all these people participated in slavery. Then he goes to the policies. He says the three-fifths compromise, right, which basically says that Black people in the South were 3/5 of a human being. So because they were 3/5 of a human being, it would only be 3/5 of that population that could be used towards the Southern vote. That could be used towards the Southern population, which could then help to strengthen the Southern vote in Congress. Because Southerners were saying, oh, well, if we use the Black people down there, we have a large population, and this can help strengthen our vote. We can get all kind of policies passed our way. And the Northerners are saying, no, you can't do that. You can't call them people when it benefits you, but then they're not people, they're property when you want to enslave them. You can't do that. And so the three-fifths compromise was created to say, okay, well, African people are only 3/5 of a human being, right? And only 3/5 of the population can be used towards this law, right? So, let me see. So even Lincoln, during his presidency, made the statement where he said if he could make slavery permanent, or he would make slavery permanent, even if that meant not going to war, right? Later on, he kind of had a change of ideas in terms of saying, you know, regardless of what the turnout was going to be with the war, he was anti-slavery. And the basis of the American structure essentially was founded on racist ideologies. Whether you have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and many other policies that were very much blatantly racist. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Act, going back to what we said earlier about the Northerners and the Southerners, lets you know that once the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, At that point, there was nowhere. That was when Harriet Tubman stopped just running to New York and started having to bring everybody to Canada, bring enslaved people to Canada, because there was nowhere in the United States for Black people to run to be free. At first, it was the North. Then they had to go all the way to Canada, because the Fugitive Slave Act basically said slavery is legal everywhere in this country, everywhere in the country. So this kind of sets us up and helps us to see that racism and race is pervasive throughout American history. Racism and race plays a very key role in how the US is being developed at its core, right? Fagan even talks about how the eradication of slavery did not do away with the belief in white supremacy. So even after the Civil War, yeah, so you pass the 13th Amendment, you're not allowed to have slavery unless people get arrested, thus this notion of the new Jim Crow, and with mass incarceration. But technically, you're not allowed to have slavery in American soil anymore. It still doesn't do away with white supremacy. It still doesn't do away with the belief that white society still feels supreme and superior over every other group, and practices these things and puts policies to support these ideas, right? Some people would argue that slavery and racism was so normal at that time that it would be unfair to judge them or label these early forefathers and foremothers racist, because it was just a part of everyday life. And I think that's an interesting kind of discussion to have. So that's something I want you to think about. You don't have to write this down. You don't have to turn it in. But I do want you to think about this, right? And you can pause the video afterwards if you want. You can just kind of sit with it for a few minutes, because I really do want you to think about this. Some people would argue that, well, Professor Grant, that it's wrong to come down on these people who were born in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, because they came up during a time where slavery was normal. Everybody was doing it. Everybody was practicing it. It was common. Having a Black person work outside, and it was just what it was. It was wrong. No doubt it was wrong, but it was wrong because we're thinking from a 2021 mindset. 1821 mindset, 1721 mindset wouldn't necessarily think that this is wrong. So can you kind of cut them some slack a little bit? That's what some people may say. Other people may argue, in 50 or 100 years, would you want somebody to judge you based on your current ideas? Maybe in 50 or 100 years, it would be absolutely insane to eat meat. People may say, oh my goodness, how could people ever eat another living thing? But now, in 2021, people eat chicken and ham and all kind of animals. Kill them and eat them. But in 50 or 100 years, it may be looked at as completely just out of the question. Things change, ideas change, people change. There are homo negative terms that can get you fired now. 20 years ago, people were saying all the time. Society changes. So some people say, hey, that's just what it was. We can't get mad at them for participating in it. That was just life. I'm glad it changed, but it's the way it was. So do you think historical figures should get a pass? Because racism was so embedded in the foundation of the United States, it was everywhere. Preachers were preaching it, politicians, everybody. Should they get a pass? Is it still wrong? Something to think about, right? And so you can pause here, or you can keep going, but something to think about. However, while that is an important question, and that's something that Fagan raises, and the reason why he raises it is because politicians during that time are actually raising these questions, and white folks during that time are raising these questions about why are we being blamed Well, we'll get to that in a second. Why are we being blamed for, something that was just normal? Fagan is saying his response is, I don't even really want to address that because that's not really what we're talking about. Because at the end of the day, to some degree, there's some truth to it. Personally, I don't think they should get a pass because wrong is wrong, right? Personally, these early Americans, these early US citizens, early US leaders absolutely knew what they were doing was wrong, right? If they were smart enough to start an entire country, I think they're smart enough to say, maybe we shouldn't chain people up and whip them and, make them work for free for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I wouldn't say historical figures should necessarily get a pass. But I think what Fagan is saying is you can't change the past. We can't dig these people up and put them on trial. They're dead. It's over. It's done. There's nothing we can do about what happened then. And Fagan is saying, and that's not my issue. My issue is not trying to change history. My issue is trying to change what was done during that time, how it created a system of oppression that still exists today. That's the problem. The problem is what that history created that is still in effect, that still allows for certain advantages and disadvantages. Henceforth, the term systemic racism. And so systemic racism, if we look at the slide, says that it is a diverse assortment of racist practices unjustly gain economic and political power of whites, the continuing resource of inequalities, and the white racist ideologies, attitudes, and institutions created to preserve white advantages and power. And so essentially what Fagan is saying is that I don't really, it's wrong, but the problem is not the racist words or thoughts. The problem is the system that is created to keep Black people and people of color in general in a position of inferiority. This is an entire system. I can't change one person. I'm not trying to change every single body, every single mind in the country. That's not my goal. My goal is to change the system that keeps allowing for these advantages and disadvantages. And when we break down this definition, what we see is that systemic racism is this diverse assortment of racist practices, right? So you have all of these different practices, whether you're talking about slavery, whether you're talking about Jim Crow, whether you're talking about lynching, whether you're talking about, the first Black to do tokenism or mass incarceration, whatever. These racist practices that provide for unjustly gained economic and political power of whites. So number one, there's this economic and political power that has been concentrated among white people, and it's been done unjustly. That means every person that was voted in office from the beginning of the United States establishment all the way till 1965, 1964, 65. I think the Voting Rights Act was passed in 65, all the way to 1965. And some would even argue up until now, they all gained their political power unjustly. Because everybody in this country could not vote legally until 1965. That was when technically the last group could vote. The Voting Rights Act was passed and legally allow, or at least on a federal level, allow for everybody to be able to vote. So anybody who came into power up until then got that power unjustly. Then you talk about the unjustly gained economic power of white people. Why? Because that economic power was started off of the backs of enslaved Black people. All right. And many people were left out of having access to that economic power. Women were left out of having access to that economic power. Oh, I missed something. Well, you all can read it for yourselves. Oh, but the natural law. Yeah, the natural law included African people, women, and Native Americans. But women were left out of the economic power. Women were left out of the political power. People of color were left out of the political power. And the economic power. And so that already creates this system of racism. And then he says, and then the continuing resource of inequality. So now that you have the power that is concentrated among white people, there are resources of inequalities that continue. So you continue to do that by segregating schools, not only segregating schools, but also giving people of color, particularly Black people, inferior schools. Now you segregate neighborhoods so that neighborhoods that are majority white are worth more. They get more money for their house, they get more wealth, they get to pass that wealth on to the next generation, and so on and so on and so on. They get the better jobs, they get the access to college, they get all of these different, right? And so that's the continuing resource of inequality. And then you continue it with criminalizing a certain group of people, and then you keep them concentrated in poverty. You keep them concentrated in certain areas, and then they get over-policed, and then they get placed into a system of criminalization. And then that's a whole entire different resource of inequality. And the white racist ideologies, attitudes, and institutions that are created to keep this thing going. The ideologies and the ideas shape the attitudes of the people, and the attitudes of the people then get voted into, or they create institutions of power, and these institutions of power preserve these white attitudes and ideologies, and it just continues and continues and continues. And so this is what people will call systemic racism, right? Those people who dominated the economic system and created the political system, religious, legal, media, family, and educational systems, all were linked to this racism, all based on white on Black domination. And so essentially what Fagan is arguing is that every aspect of society is shaped to some degree by core racist realities. Every aspect of US society has some type of core racist reality that is attached to it. And there's nothing we can do to separate ourselves from it. Then Fagan, going to the next slide, then Fagan takes us to what sits at the basis of this systemic racism. What happens psychologically? How do people start this, and how do people continue these white ideologies and attitudes at their psyche? And what he argues is that it's dehumanization. You can't be racist to somebody without first not seeing them as human. You can't be sexist to somebody without first not seeing them as human. You can't be homonegative to somebody without first not seeing them as human. You can't be classist to somebody without first not seeing them as human, at least fully human. Oppression is one person having control over another person's life or work. And so if you read Paulo Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he talks about how the worker is separated from his work. The worker is separated from his work. Very similar to what Marx will argue as well. The worker, the human being, is not connected to the value that they present. So the capitalist, the owner of the factory, sees the worker and the work as two different things. I want the work. I don't care about the worker. I don't see this person as human. All I see is the work. All I see is what that person can do to help me. That's it. Right? A sexist society means that a woman is separated from the control over her own life's choices, her body definition, her future. So in a sexist society, a woman is not a human. A woman is a collection of sexual parts. A woman is a collection of parts that bring pleasure to the male gaze, that brings pleasure to the male touch. So she's not human. She's just good enough for whatever it is that can benefit the person who is dominating. In a racist society, people of color lose control over inalienable human rights and identity. They're not people. They're good enough for what they can be used for, But in certain scenarios, if they die, they die. If something happens to them, they probably brought it on themselves. So they're not seen, even if they're seen as human beings, they're not seen as the same level of a human being as white, male, Protestant, middle class, heterosexual person, right? And so it's very important that we recognize that at the very basis of systemic racism on the psychological level is dehumanization. You have to separate the human from the person. So going back to biological racism, all men are created equal. Somebody may ask the question, well, how can they say all men are created equal, and then enslave other men? That's not right. Yes, it can. If they're not seen as men, if you take away their humanity, it's very easy to say all men are created equal and still practice slavery. Because the argument is that, oh, they're not human, they're not men, so it's fine. A man is blah, blah, blah. White, male, everything else. So when you fail to see the humanity in someone, it becomes extremely easy to overlook them. It becomes extremely easy to overlook issues and conditions that affect them. It becomes very easy to overlook unfair immigration laws or police brutality or poor housing in schools or lynching and other racialized social problems. It becomes very easy. Very easy. So dehumanization sits at the very core of the psyche of systemic racism. So one of the things that Fagan talks about is this idea of who should pay the price for what happened in the past. Bob Dole was a gentleman that was running, I think he ran for president. I don't know how many times, but he did. Very well-to-do, I think he was from Texas, very well-to-do gentleman. Very well off, very wealthy. And he said, I think that's the same. No, I'm thinking about Ross Perot. Sorry, not Bob Dole. Thinking about Ross Perot. Yeah, I don't know where Bob Dole was from, but I think he also did come from a very well-to-do family. But he said he's not sure that people in America, particularly white people, should now be paying a price for racial discrimination that happened before they were born. So my question to you is he right? Should a white person, should you, right? If you're a white person, should you, born in 2000, 2001, 99, 1999, whenever you were born, should you be paying the price for something that happened decades and centuries ago? Some people fight for affirmative action. They say that affirmative action should give opportunities to people of color. But many white people say, well, that's not fair. That's if I work just as hard as they did, why should they get the position over me? Well, it's been hundreds and hundreds of years of your people getting a position over them. So this levels the playing field. But that's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't own any Black people. I don't even think that's right. I didn't lynch anybody. I didn't march for segregation. I didn't do any of those things. I was just born in 1999, 2000. I didn't do nothing wrong. Why should I have to suffer? So is he right? Are white people suffering now for something that they didn't do? And is that fair? And so if we go to the next slide, we see, again, Fagan is addressing this question by saying, but we're missing the point. We're missing the point. It's not about, is it fair for white people to pay the price for what was done in the past? What he's saying is that we don't even have to look back at the past. There are benefits and disadvantages from what was done in the past now. It's not like slavery stopped And then in some way, policies were passed, everybody was equal, and everybody was equal from that point on. If that was the case, maybe that could be an argument. But Fagan is saying, but no, the inequality never stopped. The oppression never stopped. It continued and continued and continued and continued. And it never equalized. The playing field never equal for everybody. What he's saying is that it's not like slavery just existed, but then nobody benefited, and then people just stopped and everybody was on the same playing field. He said, no, the slavery stimulated the economy. You have somebody working free for you for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, you're going to get wealthy. These people work free for 200 and some odd years, and entire millions of them. Yeah. Yeah, that's going to definitely stimulate the economy of an entire country. Not even just an entire country. It's going to stimulate the economy of individual people. A lot of white people who are wealthy now can trace their money back to a great grandfather, grandmother, or whoever who participated in the slave trade, or to some degree benefited from the slave trade and benefited from slavery. So generational wealth for a lot of white people can be traced back to that. Then you have colorblind racism. Colorblind racism is the type of racism that exists today. Not as blatant, not as strong, not as in your face, but still there. Racism that votes for policies that block the expansion of transportation lines so that Black people and people of color can have access to transportation and get to the urban centers so that they can go to work. Colorblind racist ideas that say, well, these people have a negative culture. These people have too many children. We need to pass laws and force them, sterilize them, and force them not to be able to have kids. Colorblind racist laws that say these laws can exist that can allow for somebody to protect their personhood and their property from a person who's perceived to be a criminal or a thug. But if that same law is on the other side and the person who's perceived to be a criminal or a thug feels threatened, they can't use that same law to defend themselves. That's colorblind racism. And so this is an effect of what Fagan is saying, a racist foundation. This is an effect of slavery and Jim Crow and everything that he found in the very beginning. And then internalized oppression, the oppression that people of color perpetuate on each other because of what was taught to them, is an effect of a racist foundation. So essentially what he's saying is that it's not just about what was done in the past, it's about what's still being done now. We need to try to make it right now, or at least stop the negative effects before we can even talk about what was fair from back then. So essentially what he's arguing is that systemic racism persisted across generations. It was reproduced in socioeconomic conditions where white people control resources, the movie industry, banking, that led to poor education opportunities, residential segregation, stereotypes that perpetuated issues like lynching, white citizens councils. And many whites still benefit from these advantages. Again, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Case for Reparations, we're going to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' a piece that he wrote, I think next week. But he also wrote The Case for Reparations, and he argues we don't even have to go back all the way to slavery to make the case for why Black people should get reparations. He said we can really start in the 1950s with my and some of your maybe grandfathers. We can actually start right there, and he provides a very, very, very convincing argument. Numbers out the wazoo, it's very well written. Great piece of work. You can Google it, The Case for Reparations. Any very convincing argument. And that alone, since the 1950s, funneled millions and billions of dollars into the white community for them to be able to create generational wealth just starting in the 50s. So we don't even have to go all the way to slavery, which we already know created billions and billions of dollars. So again, that generational wealth is the stimulation of the economy done off of a racist foundation. Okay. So these things, this is very, very important. And this is what Fagan uses to address what people are saying at that time about why race still comes up. And so essentially, going to the next slide, what his argument is that the reason why race keeps coming up, the reason why Black people keep talking about race, the reason why people of color keep talking about race, the reason why white folks, many of them at that time didn't want to talk about race and kept complaining about why race is continually being brought up, why racism continually shows itself in the country. It's because he says it's a part of the foundation. It's a part of the foundation. If you're going to purchase a home, right? If you go to purchase a home and you see this beautiful home, it has everything you want, everything you're looking for, it has it. And the realtor says, this is a beautiful home and it's in your price range. But there's one problem. The foundation has a crack in it. So it kind of slides. And there's nothing we can do to fix it unless we tear down the whole house. Then you might say, oh, well, but it's so beautiful though. I'll take it. I'll take the home. Okay. You purchase the home and you fix it up nice. It is gorgeous. You live in it for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. All of a sudden, something happens that reminds you, oh, I forgot there's a crack in that foundation. Oh, okay. I need to get that fixed. And you spend $5,000, $10,000 to get that fixed. Okay, cool. And that sets you up for another 2 or 3 years. And then something happens again. What's wrong with this? Oh, I forgot there's a crack in the foundation. And so you got to spend some more money to get that fixed. If you have to keep doing that every 3, 4, 5 years, by the time you get to 30, 40 years in the house, you probably bought that house 2, 3 times over. Just because you're fixing things that are the effects of a crack in the foundation. Now, how do you fix the foundation? Some people would argue you can't fix a foundation without tearing down the whole house. And so Fagan is arguing that the reason why racism keeps coming up is because it's the crack in America's foundation. It's the thing that's going to keep coming up no matter how you try to put bandages over it, no matter what policies you pass to try to placate it. If you don't deal with this thing head on, if you don't deal with it head on and talk about how racism is in the very Constitution that governs the lives of all of these people, if you can't come to grips with that and deal with that, it's going to keep coming up over and over and over and over and over again. It's like if a mouse or a rat has ever died in your house or wherever you live, and it starts to sting, you can't do anything until you find it. You may not know where it is, but you got to find it because your house, you can spray and spray and spray and spray and spray and spray and spray. There's nothing you can do. That thing is going to be potent until you find where that dead mouse or that dead rat is and get rid of it. And that's what racism is. That's what racism is. That is Fagan's argument. And that's what systemic racism is. Right? So the fact that this thing is in the very systems that govern our country. And so the argument is that this racism divides the collaborative efforts. It doesn't just affect people of color. He says it also affects white people. Here he's talking about Bacon's Rebellion. William Julius Wilson talks about this in his 1979 book, The Declining Significance of Race. Bacon's Rebellion. This was a time where poor white people were looking at Black people and saying, well, we being treated just almost as bad as y'all. We really on the same level. We need to collaborate and fight against the rich white man. And that's what they did. and almost won. Almost won. They were very close because it was a lot of them. It was a lot of poor whites and there was a lot of enslaved black people. And they were like, if we band together, we can overtake them. There's nowhere near as many of them as it is of us. And so rich white people saw that and said, okay, we can't have this because they can absolutely win. It's too many of them. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna increase this racial narrative and make the poor whites just a little bit better than the blacks. And if we make them feel just a little bit better than the black people, they're not gonna want to risk that position to come back down here to help them. They ain't gonna want to do that. And so they increase these race efforts, these racist ideas. Division between black and white feminists. There was a time where black women and white women were saying, hey, all of us are women. Together, we can fight this male-dominated society. Together, we can get rights for all women. Let's do this. And they tried. But racism between black women and white women caused the feminist efforts to go this way. Caused white feminists to say, well, we don't really want to deal with this. And black feminists to say, no, we have to deal with this. I'm fighting for you, but it doesn't seem like you're fighting for my people. So black feminists had to go their own way. So racism devised the collaborative efforts that could happen across racial categories to help really make this a much more egalitarian society. And so going to the next slide, what Fagan does is Fagan says there has to be, and there has and continues to be, a resistance. We can't just talk about racism and talk about all the things that it does without talking about the resistance that people of color who are victims of racism continue to push. There was a resistance that led to the end of slavery. Some people say the end of slavery came from the Civil War. Well, the Civil War was also fought because there were a lot of black people who were resisting, who were rebelling, who would not work, who were running away. And it really just disrupted the Southern economy. They had to do something. Resistance led to the establishment of the NAACP and gradual equal rights. It led to the end of legal segregation. It led to the creation of the civil rights movement. Both nonviolent and violent ways of ending racism has helped. But even in that, we still have poverty. We still have unequal education. We still have police misconduct. We still have all of these things that affect racism and that racism affects. So still a lot of work that needs to be done. So that's essentially what systemic racism theory looks at. Also want to talk a little bit about racial formation theory. Racial formation theory takes this kind of macro approach that Fagan uses to explain racism, and they make it a little bit more micro, right? If you have taken any sociology courses, you know that there's something called conflict theory, which will probably be like more systemic racism. Then you have what's called symbolic interactionism, which is more of the individual relationships between people, right? In the study of that. Racial formation theory is more of symbolic interactions, right? It was created by, so the way in which Fagan, although Fagan did, and Fagan will tell you, even in Racist America, he did not create systemic racism. Systemic racism in this conversation was long before him, and he pays homage to the many, many Black scholars who wrote about it and talked about it. Maybe not saying systemic racism, but talked about the same exact thing. And he just kind of came up with that name, that kind of stuff. And he also understood that his white privilege allowed for him to kind of be able to do that. But he absolutely pays homage to the many Black scholars that came before him that laid the foundation for that kind of discourse. Omi and Wanat came up with this idea of racial formation theory. And their racial formation theory in the United States was a way of analyzing ethnicity, assimilation, class stratification, nationalism, colonialism, and how all of these things explicate race in the United States. Racial formation theory is looks at the way in which these kind of racial categories, right, are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed in societies. It looks at how racial categories and racialized, what they call racial projects, how these racial projects and racial projects are just actions that exist, right? Racialized situations that come up that then cause us to re-examine race in this country. So Fagan is looking at this whole system. Racial formation theory is saying these racial projects like the murder of Trayvon Martin, racial projects like the election of Donald Trump, racial projects like the election of Barack Obama, racial projects like the LA riots, racial projects like the creation of hip hop, racial projects, all these different kind of racial projects, right, are used and viewed as a way of showing the competition, the socio-political, what they call contestations or resistance or conflict that occurs among people of varying racial ethnic groups. And so these racial projects that are done on this individual level essentially help us explain these larger racial categories and how race is created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed, and then recreated in our society. How the meaning of race gets transformed and changed from generation to generation, or even in between, or even within generations, intergenerationally and intragenerationally. So racial formation theory exists. It's kind of this unstable, decentered, it's these complexities of social meanings, and it's always being transformed, usually by a political struggle, usually by something related to politics, rules, laws that are being broken, laws that should be broken. And for these racial projects to exist, there has to be a form of racism. And this form of racism is created by some type of dominating structure that is based on essentialist ideas. And if you remember anything about, if you've taken a sociology class, you know, essentialism is this kind of like this binary, right? This idea that certain groups are naturally, certain characteristics are naturally applied to certain groups. Gender essentialism, racial essentialism, same thing. Right. And so these racial projects are essentially racist because of these essential categories that are placed next to these racial groups. And usually there's some type of political struggle or conflict happening on the individual level that helps to shape the race. And so that is what racial formation theory says, is all these racial projects put together to form these larger ideas around race. Racial formation theory looks at how the state, this is the next slide, looks at how the state, our country, politics, the government plays a role in shaping the meanings and the realities of race. So racial formation theory is very political. The state sits at the center because while people can behave however they want, it is the state that either justifies or criticizes these actions. No, in LA in 1990 or 1991, nobody could necessarily stop those police officers from beating up Rodney King. People can do what they want to do. But it was the state who said they're not guilty. That shaped a racial meaning, that shaped a racial reality, that sent the message to the Black community in Los Angeles to say, you white people can do what they want to Black people, and it is legal. The state sits at the center, and the state allowed for that to happen, which caused resistance. It caused Black people to say that's not going to happen. And it caused them to essentially burn down a good portion of Los Angeles. Racial meanings, racial realities, started by the state's role in this racial project of these white police officers beating up this Black man, and it was caught on camera in the early 90s. Now it's much, it's more common to catch that on camera, but at the time it was not. Racial projects politically and legally reorganized the state. So as we see, for example, like in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, as racial projects occur, as people resist, as one group of people feels resistance and or pushes against another group and another group feels resistance and pushes back, this going of the back and forth is now helping to change policies and laws and hopefully reorganize the state in a positive way. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Some people can say it was these racial projects that helped to create and helped to lead to the voting in of the first Black president in Barack Obama. And some people may say it was those same racial projects that made people mad at Barack Obama and then made people vote for Donald Trump. So there is a reorganization, whether in some people may see the reorganization as being positive or negative. It's just like a pendulum. It swings one way to another. You have other formation theory concepts like racial dictatorship, racial democracy, and racial rule, which all are kind of interrelated and helps us to understand these connections, these associations within racial formation theory. Unfortunately, ideas like institutional racism, systemic racism don't appear in racial formation theory. And so that's why sometimes they are at odds with each other. Now, I present both. I'm kind of biased towards systemic racism, but I present both because you can take on whatever theory you believe works for, for the way in which you see race and way in which you understand race in the United States. Right. And these aren't the only theories. There are other theories that are out there, right? These are kind of the main ones. But there are other theories out there. And so I do think it's important to see them, to hear the different arguments and the pros and cons of each. And then everybody can, you can just kind of decide what works for you. But I do think racial formation theory, in a lot of ways, is still very much important. And it's important to talk to and at least introduce to students taking a class like Race, Place, and Inequality. And we're going to see racial projects happening, particularly in place, particularly when we're talking about place. We're going to see these racial projects that are in many ways inherently unequal that are going to occur, and how systemic racism sits as kind of the macro view of these racial projects. So it's going to be interesting. Anyway, that is all for today. There are no assignments or discussions this week, so enjoy the rest of your week, enjoy your weekend, and you will see me again on Monday with another lecture video. All right. Feel free to reach out to me during my office hours if you need me, if there's any questions you have about the class or anything you want to discuss, and have a great day.